Hampshire, 1944. The mess hall doors opened to reveal long tables set with metal trays, the air thick with smells that made empty stomachs clench, and memories of home surface unbidden. Through the entrance, German prisoners filed in slowly, faces showing the exhaustion of men who hadn't eaten properly in weeks, perhaps months. They had been told what to expect from British military rations. Inedible slop designed to keep prisoners barely alive, food so poor it would make them grateful for whatever scraps they received, meals that would demonstrate their defeat through calculated nutritional humiliation. What sat on those trays instead stopped them mid-step. Porridge that steamed with actual heat. Bread that looked like bread rather than sawdust compressed into loaves. Margarine, jam, tea with milk and sugar. Real food. More food than many German civilians were eating. For a moment, the only sound was 300 men breathing, trying to process what their eyes were showing them. Everything they had been taught about British weakness, about enemy nations collapsing under their own deprivation, about Germany's superior position even in defeat, was about to shatter against something simple and undeniable. The British were feeding their enemies better than Germany was feeding its own people. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favour, tap like, so this story isn't buried. Show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. And share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The journey to this impossible moment had begun 5 weeks earlier on a rain-soaked morning outside Caen. Peter Hartmann stood among 285 men in a bombed-out factory courtyard, his Wehrmacht Supply Corps uniform showing the stains of someone who'd spent 3 years managing food distribution across occupied territories. He was 30, a baker's son from Cologne who understood food, understood nutrition, understood exactly how close Germany had come to starvation, even before the recent defeats. Around him, infantry soldiers, tank crews, administrative clerks, even a nutritionist from Berlin who'd been developing synthetic food supplements for the Wehrmacht, all captured as Allied forces swept through Normandy. They had expected immediate execution or perhaps starvation as revenge for the U-boat campaign that had tried to starve Britain. The propaganda had been explicit. Britain was on the verge of collapse, food supplies nearly exhausted, the population surviving on rations that barely sustained life. German prisoners would receive even less, would slowly starve, as demonstration of what happened to enemies of the Reich. Instead, they received medical examinations that included checking for malnutrition, basic rations immediately upon capture that included actual protein, and transport to Britain under conditions that suggested their captors understood food mattered for keeping prisoners functional. The Channel crossing was miserable in every way except one. They were fed, not lavishly, but consistently. Hardtack biscuits that were designed for long storage but provided calories, canned meat that wasn't fresh but was protein, tea that was hot and sweet. The contrast with what German soldiers had been eating in the final months of fighting was stark. Peter kept a small notebook hidden in his jacket, writing observations when possible. September the 3rd, 1944. British Guards gave us canned beef today. Real beef. I haven't seen real beef in 6 months. German army rations had been potatoes and ersatz bread and hope. How can a nation supposedly starving feed prisoners real meat? Something is wrong with what we were told. The English landscape looked impossible when they disembarked at Southampton. Not the bombed wasteland promised by propaganda, not fields lying fallow from lack of workers, not a nation on the brink of agricultural collapse. Instead, functional farms, livestock grazing in managed pastures, villages that looked intact and prosperous, countryside that suggested a nation dealing with war rationing, but nowhere near the starvation that had been promised. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. British soldiers processed them with bureaucratic efficiency. Medical exams included questions about recent diet, notes about malnutrition levels, concerns about men who'd clearly been underfed. One British medical officer, examining Peter and noting his Supply Corps background, asked through a translator, "When did you last eat fresh vegetables?" "January, sir, maybe February." The medical officer made a note, his expression showing something between pity and professional concern. "You'll need vitamin supplementation, scurvy risk. We'll address that in camp diet." Peter almost laughed. A British doctor concerned about German prisoners getting scurvy, about proper nutrition for enemies. It made no sense according to everything propaganda had taught. The trucks drove north through Hampshire countryside showing early autumn harvest, fields being cleared, vegetables being gathered, a managed agricultural system that looked organised and productive. Nothing suggested a nation starving, a people desperately short of food, an economy on the verge of collapse from naval blockade. "Where are the starving British?" whispered Klaus Richter in German. He was 24, an infantry soldier from Munich who'd believed completely in propaganda promises about Britain's imminent collapse. Propaganda said they were eating rats, said cities were rioting for bread. But look at them. They look normal. An older prisoner, Oberst Wolfgang Bauer, a career officer of 48 who'd commanded supply logistics and knew exactly what German cities looked like now, replied quietly, "Either propaganda lied about Britain, or everything we see here is elaborate deception. I'm beginning to suspect the former." Camp 100 emerged from Hampshire farmland like a temporary military installation built with permanence in mind. Rows of wooden huts, arranged in precise order, administrative buildings that looked functional and well maintained, and most tellingly, a mess hall that was larger than seemed necessary unless feeding was taken seriously. The camp commandant was a British colonel named Richard Pemberton, a man of 52 with a bearing that suggested peacetime career rather than wartime commission. He stood at the administration building entrance as trucks delivered prisoners, his uniform neat despite work that clearly kept him busy. "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention requirements," he said through a translator, a British Jewish refugee who spoke German with a Frankfurt accent. His voice was firm, but not hostile. "This includes provision of adequate food. You will receive British Army standard rations, same quality and quantity as British soldiers. We do not believe in starving prisoners. Hungry men cannot work effectively, cannot maintain health, cannot contribute to camp order. You will be fed properly." The German prisoners stood in formation, September sun warm on their backs, trying to understand these words. British Army standard rations had to be propaganda. Britain was starving. Everyone knew Britain was starving. How could starving Britain feed prisoners the same as its soldiers? Colonel Pemberton continued, "Some of you appear malnourished. Our medical staff will address this. Some of you have been surviving on inadequate rations for months. This will change. Food is not a weapon here. Food is basic necessity, provided regardless of nationality." That first evening, as sun set over Hampshire hills, prisoners were directed to the mess hall. Peter entered, with the wary tension of someone who'd spent years managing food scarcity, someone who knew exactly how little it took to keep humans functioning, someone who understood the difference between survival rations and adequate nutrition. The smell hit first. Cooking food. Real cooking food. Not the thin soup smell of German military kitchens in recent months. Not the ersatz coffee and sawdust bread smell that had defined Wehrmacht rations, but actual food being prepared with actual ingredients. The serving line was staffed by British soldiers who moved with the efficiency of professional cooks. They weren't contemptuous or cruel, just businesslike, serving portions with practiced motions that suggested this was routine rather than special treatment. Peter watched the man ahead of him receive his tray and nearly gasped at what he saw placed on it. Then it was his turn. The British cook, a corporal, perhaps 40, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked in kitchens for years, placed items on Peter's tray with methodical precision. Porridge. Actual oat porridge, thick and steaming, sweetened with something, maybe sugar, maybe honey, but definitely sweetened. A portion that looked like maybe 6 ounces, enough to fill stomach and provide genuine calories. 2 slices of bread, not the grey ersatz bread that had become German standard, not sawdust compressed with minimal flour, but actual wheat bread. Coarse, dark, clearly made with rationed ingredients, but recognizably bread made from grain. Margarine, a small pat, maybe half an ounce, but real fat, real calories, the kind of food that German civilians were dreaming about. Jam, strawberry or raspberry, a spoonful, bright red against the institutional metal tray, so unexpected that Peter thought he might be hallucinating. Tea, not ersatz coffee made from acorns or roasted grains, but actual tea, and next to the cup, small containers of milk and sugar. Real milk, real sugar. Luxuries that hadn't been available in Germany for years. Peter carried his tray to a table in stunned silence. Around him, 285 German prisoners sat with similar trays, staring at food that contradicted everything they'd been told, everything they'd believed, everything that propaganda had promised about British starvation and German resilience. Some men sat frozen, afraid to touch what must be deception or test. Others began eating immediately, bodies overriding minds, hunger trumping suspicion. Peter ate slowly, methodically, analysing each component with the professional assessment of someone who'd spent years in food logistics. The porridge was made from real oats, cooked with water and possibly some milk, sweetened adequately. It provided complex carbohydrates, some protein, genuine nutrition. The bread was wheat-based, with some darker grain mixed in. Heavier than pre-war white bread, but vastly superior to anything German soldiers had eaten in months. The margarine was standard military issue, probably fortified with vitamins based on British practice he'd heard about. The jam provided quick sugars and minimal vitamins. The tea was real tea, and the milk and sugar were exactly what they appeared to be. This wasn't starvation rations. This wasn't even minimal survival food. This was adequate military nutrition, designed to keep soldiers healthy and functional, and Britain, supposedly starving Britain, was providing this to enemy prisoners. Peter wrote that night in his hidden notebook. Today, I ate better than I have eaten in 6 months. Better than German soldiers in my supply unit ate. Better than German civilians eat now. Either propaganda lied about British starvation, or we have been transported to some fantasy version of Britain that doesn't exist. I don't understand anymore. Food doesn't lie. You can't fake bread or sugar or milk. These things exist or they don't. And they exist here, provided to prisoners, to enemies. What does this mean? The pattern continued. Breakfast every morning at 7 o'clock a.m. Porridge, bread, margarine, jam, tea. Not varying, not depending on camp behaviour or work output, just consistently provided. Lunch at noon, typically sandwiches made with actual bread and actual filling, sometimes tinned meat, sometimes cheese, sometimes egg paste, plus soup or stew, plus tea. Dinner at 6 o'clock p.m., the main meal. Some form of protein, stew meat, tinned fish, occasionally fresh meat if farm work provided it, potatoes or other vegetables, bread, tea. The quantity was moderate, clearly rationed, but it was consistent and adequate. British soldiers guarding the camp ate visibly similar rations. This wasn't prisoners being given scraps while guards ate luxuriously. This was an entire military system operating on rationed but adequate food, with prisoners included in that system rather than excluded from it. Within 2 weeks, visible changes appeared. Men who'd arrived gaunt began filling out slightly. Skin that had been greyish from malnutrition took on healthier colour. Energy levels rose. Prisoners who'd been lethargic became capable of work. The medical officer who'd worried about scurvy proved correct. Several men showed early signs, but supplementary rations of preserved vegetables addressed the deficiency. Peter made friends with one of the British cooks, a Scotsman named Sergeant Donald McLeish, 45 years old, who'd been a chef in Glasgow before the war and now managed camp kitchen with professional pride. McLeish spoke no German. Peter's English was limited, but they communicated through the universal language of people who understand food. One afternoon during kitchen work detail, Peter had been assigned to help with food preparation based on his Supply Corps background. McLeish showed him the ration allocation chart. Through gestures and simple words, McLeish explained. British soldiers received daily rations calculated to provide approximately 3,000 calories, adjusted for activity level. German prisoners received the same base allocation as British soldiers in non-combat roles, approximately 2,800 calories, adequate for health and work capacity. This wasn't generosity. This was policy based on practical recognition that adequately fed prisoners were healthier, more productive, less troublesome, and better suited for eventual repatriation. "Hungry men fight," McLeish said in slow, clear English, gesturing to make meaning obvious. "Fed men work. We want work, not fight. Simple." But it wasn't simple to Peter, to Klaus, to any of the German prisoners who'd been told that Britain was on the verge of starvation, that German U-boats had successfully cut supply lines, that British citizens were rioting for bread, while German citizens were well-fed and prosperous. The food on their trays every day told a different story. British rations were adequate. British citizens weren't starving. British agriculture was functioning. British food distribution was organised and effective. The contrast with Germany became more apparent as mail service was established and letters arrived from home. Peter's letter from his father in Cologne, written in August before postal service was disrupted completely, described eating potato peels and cabbage stumps, described bread that was more sawdust than flour, described his bakery closed for lack of ingredients, described neighbours dying from hunger-related diseases. His father wrote, "We are told Germany is winning, that the Reich provides for its people, that enemy nations are collapsing while we stand strong. But Peter, we are starving. Your mother weighs perhaps 80 pounds now. She is dying slowly. If you are alive, if you are captured, I hope you are in British or American hands. At least they have food." Peter read this letter by lamplight in his barracks, surrounded by men reading similar letters from home, similar descriptions of starvation and deprivation, similar pleas to stay captured rather than return to a Germany where food no longer existed. And the cognitive dissonance was complete. Germany, which had promised abundance and strength, was starving. Britain, which had supposedly been starved into submission, was feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its own citizens. Klaus received a letter from his sister in Munich, describing trading family heirlooms for potatoes, describing children with distended bellies from malnutrition, describing elderly neighbours dying quietly from hunger. She wrote, "You are lucky to be in British hands. At least you will survive. Germany has nothing left. We were told we were the master race, the superior people. But superior people don't starve while feeding their conquerors. I think we were lied to about everything." In October, something happened that crystallized the transformation happening in prisoners' minds. A Red Cross inspection team visited Camp 100, standard procedure for verifying Geneva Convention compliance. The team included a neutral Swiss nutritionist who examined camp rations, inspected kitchen facilities, reviewed meal logs, and interviewed prisoners about food quality and quantity. Peter was selected for interview based on his Supply Corps background. The Swiss nutritionist, Dr. Heinrich Müller, spoke German and conducted the interview with clinical precision. He asked about pre-capture nutrition, about Wehrmacht rations in final months of combat, about current camp rations, about any deficiencies or complaints. Peter answered honestly, describing the dramatic improvement from near-starvation Wehrmacht rations to adequate British camp food. Dr. Müller made notes, his expression neutral professional assessment. "Are you aware," Dr. Müller asked, "that British civilian rations are more restricted than what you receive here?" Peter hadn't been aware. "Sir, British civilians receive rations calculated at approximately 2,500 calories daily, with significant restrictions on meat, butter, sugar, and other items. You receive military allocation, which is more generous." British citizens are giving up food so that British soldiers and prisoners of war can be adequately fed. This is policy choice, not abundance. The weight of this settled over Peter like physical pressure. Britain wasn't feeding prisoners from surplus. Britain was rationing its own citizens strictly so that military policy, including prisoner feeding, could be maintained. British families were eating less so that German prisoners could eat adequately. Why would they do that? Dr. Muller answered the unspoken question. They do it because Geneva Convention requires adequate prisoner feeding, and British government believes following international law matters even when costly. They do it because properly fed prisoners are investment in post-war stability. They do it because they believe civilization requires maintaining standards even when those standards are expensive. He paused. Your propaganda told you Britain was weak, collapsing, starving. You now eat British food daily. You tell me, is Britain collapsing? No, sir. Your propaganda told you Germany was strong, prosperous, providing for its people. You now read letters from home describing starvation. You tell me, is Germany prosperous? No, sir. Then perhaps propaganda lied about many things, and perhaps food is truth that cannot be propagandized away. You cannot fake bread. You cannot pretend sugar exists when it doesn't. Food is reality, and reality is teaching you what propaganda could not. That conversation changed everything for Peter. He began looking at camp food not as mysterious British behaviour, but as evidence of economic and social organisation that propaganda had denied existed. Britain was rationed, yes, but functioning. Agriculture was managed. Distribution was organised. Supply lines were maintained. Citizens sacrificed for military needs. The system worked, even under the pressure of 6 years of war. Meanwhile, Germany, which had promised autarky and self-sufficiency, which had claimed racial superiority, which had insisted the Reich would last 1,000 years, was starving. Not because of lack of agricultural land or absence of farmers, but because the system had prioritized military conquest over sustainable food production, had treated occupied territories as resources to exploit rather than partners to cooperate with, had burned through reserves without planning for long-term survival. Peter began teaching others what he understood about food logistics. Evening discussions in the barracks became informal education sessions about nutrition, about agricultural systems, about what adequate rations revealed about underlying economic organisation. He explained that the consistent quality of British camp food wasn't luck or temporary surplus. It was evidence of a functioning supply chain that extended from farms to distribution centres to military facilities. He explained that British willingness to feed prisoners adequately while rationing their own citizens showed commitment to international law even when expensive. They feed us not because they like us, Peter explained one evening to a group of younger prisoners who still clung to propaganda certainties, but because they believe in systems and rules and maintaining civilization even during war. They ration their own children so prisoners of war receive adequate nutrition. That's not weakness, that's strength. That's a society that believes its principles matter more than its immediate desires. November brought additional revelations. Some prisoners were assigned to work on British farms, helping with late harvest and winter preparation. These work parties discovered that British farms, while struggling with labour shortages, were still productive. Mechanisation compensated for missing workers. Women and older men managed tasks that young men had done before war. Prisoners supplemented labour without being exploited. And the farms produced food, not abundantly, not luxuriously, but adequately. Peter's work party was sent to a farm managed by a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, whose husband had died at Dunkirk and whose 2 sons were fighting somewhere in Europe. She was 53, managed 200 acres with help from her elderly father and now German prisoners, and approached farming with the practical competence of someone who understood that crops don't care about politics. Mrs. Thornton fed the prisoners lunch while they worked, sandwiches made from home-baked bread, soup made from vegetables grown on her farm, tea that she served in her kitchen as if they were workers rather than enemies. The food was simple but genuine, and she ate the same food herself, demonstrating that this wasn't performance but simply how she operated. One afternoon during lunch break, sitting in her farmhouse kitchen that showed signs of pre-war prosperity now faded by wartime restrictions, Peter asked through the guard, who translated, "Why do you feed us like this? Your husband died fighting Germans. Your sons fight Germans now. Why show kindness?" Mrs. Thornton was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea methodically. Finally, "Because you're men far from home doing work that needs doing. Because I was taught that you feed people who work for you, regardless of who they are. Because my husband would have wanted me to maintain standards, even when standards are difficult." She paused. "And because I hope, wherever my sons are, if they're prisoners, someone is feeding them decently. Maybe if we treat prisoners like humans, others will do the same. Maybe that's naive, but it's what I believe." That evening, Peter wrote, "Today a British widow whose husband died fighting Germans fed me home-baked bread and vegetables from her garden. She did this not because she's required to, not because I deserve it, but because she believes in feeding people who work. Her sons might be prisoners in Germany, might be starving because Germany doesn't share her beliefs about feeding enemies. The moral superiority we claimed rings hollow when British widows show more humanity than German Reich." December brought winter, and also brought news from Germany that made camp food even more significant. Letters described the turnip winter, beginning, a terrible echo of the 1916-17 famine from the First War. Urban populations were eating animal feed and tree bark. The black market was the only source of adequate food, and prices were so high that only the very wealthy could afford nutrition. Children were dying from malnutrition. The elderly were dying from hunger-related complications. Germany was experiencing famine while fighting continued. And in Camp 100, German prisoners ate porridge, bread, margarine, jam, stew, potatoes, vegetables, and drank tea with milk and sugar. Not lavishly, not abundantly, but adequately, consistently, reliably. The contrast was so stark that some prisoners struggled to process the guilt of eating while families starved. Klaus received a letter from his mother that he read aloud to the barracks one December evening. "My darling son, I am glad you are alive, and pray you are in British hands because I have heard they feed prisoners. We have nothing here. Your father traded his watch for a loaf of bread last week. Your sister is ill from hunger, but there is no medicine and no doctors who will see us without payment we cannot provide. I am telling you this not to hurt you, but because I want you to know. Don't come home yet. Stay where you are until war ends and they send you back. At least you are alive. At least you are fed. That is more than most Germans can say now. Your mother, who loves you." The barracks was silent after Klaus finished reading. 300 men confronting the reality that being a prisoner in Britain was safer and healthier than being free in Germany. The propaganda that had promised German superiority had delivered German starvation. The Britain that was supposedly collapsing was maintaining its prisoners adequately even while rationing its own citizens. Peter spoke into the silence. "We were told that strength meant domination, that being strong meant taking what you wanted from others, that superior races deserved abundance while inferior races deserved nothing." He paused. "But look at what that philosophy produced. Germany is starving. Our families are dying. Meanwhile, Britain, which we called weak because they believe in rules and laws and treating even enemies with basic dignity, Britain feeds us. Feeds us better than Germany feeds its own people. Maybe we had strength and weakness backwards. Maybe the real strength is being able to feed your enemies while your own citizens sacrifice. Maybe weakness is starving your own people while claiming superiority." In January 1945, Camp 100 received a directive from British War Office clarifying prisoner ration policy. Colonel Pemberton read it during a camp assembly, wanting prisoners to understand the reasoning behind their treatment. Prisoner of war rations are maintained at adequate levels for the following reasons. First, Geneva Convention requires it, and Britain is signatory to Geneva Convention. Second, properly fed prisoners are healthier, more productive, and less prone to resistance or escape attempts. Third, treatment of prisoners reflects national values and will be remembered when peace comes. Fourth, Britain expects its own prisoners to be adequately fed and maintains standards in hopes of reciprocal treatment. Fifth, adequate prisoner rations are investment in post-war stability and rehabilitation. Pemberton paused, looking over the assembled prisoners. Some of you wonder why we feed you when your own nation starves. The answer is simple. We feed you because that's who we choose to be. Because we believe civilization matters even during war. Because we believe rules matter even when following them is costly. Because we believe human beings deserve basic dignity even when they're enemies. His voice strengthened. You were taught that this kind of thinking was weakness. You were told that nations that follow rules would be defeated by nations that don't. But look around you. You are fed. You are healthy. Germany starves. Which philosophy proved strong and which proved weak? That evening, discussions in the barracks focused on a question that couldn't be easily answered. If Britain could feed prisoners adequately while enduring U-boat blockade, why couldn't Germany feed its own citizens while controlling most of Europe? The answer was uncomfortable. Germany had prioritized military conquest over sustainable food production, had exploited occupied territories until they collapsed, had treated agriculture as resource to extract rather than system to maintain. Britain had prioritized sustainability, had rationed strictly to ensure everyone received something, even if no one received abundance, had maintained agricultural systems even under pressure. Food had become a moral referendum on two philosophies of governance, one that claimed strength through domination and produced starvation, one that claimed civilization through rules and produced adequate nutrition even for enemies. By February, many prisoners had undergone visible transformation. Men who'd arrived gaunt now looked healthy. Skin had proper colour, energy levels were normal. The medical officer noted in his logs that scurvy cases had resolved, that malnutrition indicators had improved, that overall health of prisoner population was significantly better than upon arrival. Adequate food, it turned out, really mattered for human health. This shouldn't have been revolutionary knowledge, but for men raised on propaganda about willpower triumphing over physical needs, it was. Sergeant McLeish, the Scottish cook, noticed the change. One afternoon, while Peter helped with meal preparation, McLeish commented through their limited shared language. You lot arrived looking like scarecrows. Now you look like soldiers again. That's what food does. Proper food. We don't need you dying of hunger. We need you healthy, so when war ends, you can go home and rebuild. Can't rebuild if you're dead. Why do you care if we rebuild? Peter asked. We are enemy. McLeish shrugged. Won't always be enemy. War ends eventually. Then what? Do we want Germany populated by starved, angry men looking for revenge? Or fed, healthy men who remember they were treated decently? We're thinking about post-war world. You're part of that world. Better you remember British food as adequate than remember it as starvation. This pragmatic long-term thinking was as much revelation as the food itself. Britain was feeding prisoners not just because convention required it, but because they were thinking 10 years ahead, thinking about what kind of Germany they wanted to interact with after war, thinking about how treatment of prisoners now would influence relationships later. This required planning, required resources, required believing that investment in former enemies might produce future partners. Germany, by contrast, had thought only about immediate conquest, about extracting maximum resources from occupied territories without concern for sustainability, about treating enemies as things to be used up, rather than humans who might someday need to be lived alongside. The short-term thinking had produced short-term gains and long-term collapse. In March, Red Cross established full postal service, and Peter began corresponding with his father regularly. His father wrote about starvation in Cologne, but also wrote asking Peter to describe British food, British farming, British rationing systems. "Tell me everything," his father wrote. "Write down what they do, how they organize, how they maintain food distribution even under pressure. Germany will need to learn this when war ends. We will need to rebuild food systems. We will need to learn from people who maintained theirs. Write it all down." Peter did. He kept detailed notes about British military rations, about kitchen organisation, about rationing systems, about agricultural policies, about how Britain had managed to feed its population adequately, if not abundantly, through 6 years of war. He documented portion sizes, meal schedules, nutritional composition, supply chain logistics. He created what amounted to a manual for maintaining food security under wartime constraints. His notes revealed British strategy: strict rationing but fair distribution, everyone receiving something rather than some receiving abundance while others starved. Priority to growing calories rather than luxury foods. Mechanization to compensate for labor loss. Government coordination of agriculture rather than leaving it to market chaos. Import management, focusing on essential nutrients. Public education about nutrition and cooking with limited ingredients. Enforcement of regulations to prevent black market from undermining system. Germany had done nearly the opposite: unequal distribution favouring party members, focus on prestige projects rather than practical farming, exploitation of occupied territories rather than cooperation, minimal mechanization due to metal priorities for weapons, chaotic overlapping authorities managing food with no coordination, tolerance of black market that meant wealthy ate well while poor starved. The evidence was undeniable. British food system worked. German food system had collapsed. And this said something fundamental about the two philosophies of governance. April brought Germany's collapse and news that made camp rations even more significant. Concentration camps were being liberated, revealing that while German prisoners in British camps ate adequately, victims of German camps had been deliberately starved to death. The moral contrast couldn't have been sharper. Britain fed its enemies. Germany starved its victims. Some prisoners refused to believe the concentration camp reports initially, insisted they were propaganda. But others, including Peter, recognized the consistency. A government that couldn't feed its own citizens certainly wouldn't feed people it considered subhuman. A government that prioritized conquest over sustainability wouldn't waste resources on people it planned to kill anyway. The starvation in camps was logical extension of the starvation in German cities. A system that had lost the ability or will to provide for people it governed. In May, Germany surrendered. At Camp 100, Colonel Pemberton called assembly to address what this meant. Prisoners stood in spring sunshine that felt inappropriate for such heavy news about their nation's total defeat. "The war is concluded," Pemberton said. "You will be repatriated over coming months. Until then, camp operations continue as before, including food provision at current standards." He paused. "When you return home, you will face a Germany without adequate food. Your families are starving. Your cities are destroyed. Your agricultural system is collapsed. What you learned here about British food systems, about rationing, about maintaining nutrition under constraint, that knowledge is valuable. Take it home, use it, teach it. Help rebuild German agriculture based on principles that work: fair distribution, sustainable production, long-term planning. You were fed here not because we pitied you, but because we believed adequate food was basic, right even for prisoners. You were fed because we thought about post-war world and wanted you healthy enough to participate in rebuilding. You were fed because civilization requires maintaining standards even when costly." His voice strengthened. "Remember that. Remember that the Britain you were told was starving fed you better than Germany fed its own people. Remember that following rules and maintaining civilization proves stronger than abandoning rules for short-term advantage. Remember that food doesn't lie. You can't fake bread or sugar or milk. These things exist, or they don't. And they existed here, shared with enemies, while propaganda claimed they didn't exist at all. That evening, Peter and Klaus and hundreds of others reflected on what British food had taught them. Not just nutrition, though that mattered, but about systems and priorities and what different philosophies produced when tested by war. "We were told Britain was weak," Klaus said quietly. "That democracy made people soft, that authoritarian control produced strength. But Britain's weakness fed us for 9 months. Germany's strength starved its own people. I don't think we understood what strength means." Peter nodded. "Strength is maintaining systems when maintaining them is hard. Strength is feeding enemies when your own citizens sacrifice. Strength is thinking 10 years ahead even when you're fighting for survival today. We called these things weakness. We were wrong." Repatriation began in June. Groups processed, documented, sent home to a Germany that was exactly as described in letters: starving, destroyed, barely functioning. Peter returned to Cologne carrying his detailed notes about British food systems, about rationing, about how to maintain nutrition under constraint. His father had survived, barely, weighing perhaps 90 pounds now at age 58. They embraced in the ruins of what had been their family bakery, 2 men trying to reconnect across a gap wider than the years of separation. That first night, in a basement that served as home now, Peter shared British Army biscuits he'd been given for the journey. His father ate slowly, reverently, as if the simple hardtack was feast food, which by German standards of May 1945, it was. "Tell me everything," his father said, "about British food, about how they organised, about how they maintained systems. Germany needs to learn this. I need to learn this. I want to reopen the bakery. I want to feed people again. But I need to know how to do it when everything is collapsed." Peter spent the next weeks teaching his father everything he'd learned. About rationing systems, about fair distribution, about sustainable production, about maintaining quality even with limited ingredients, about thinking long-term rather than just surviving day to day. His notes became basis for their rebuilding plan. Within a year, the Hartmann Bakery was operating again, producing bread from occupation authority rations, using British techniques Peter had learned, maintaining standards even when standards were difficult. The bakery became known for fair dealing, for consistent quality, for treating customers with dignity even when resources were scarce. Peter often told people this came from watching British cooks maintain standards while feeding enemy prisoners, from learning that civilization meant not abandoning principles even when abandoning them would be easier. Klaus returned to Munich, found work in food distribution for American occupation authorities, brought to it the understanding that feeding people adequately was investment in stability rather than just charity. His experience with British rations influenced how he approached German food security, how he advocated for fair distribution systems, how he insisted that everyone receiving something was more important than some people receiving abundance. Sergeant Donald McLeish returned to Glasgow, reopened his restaurant, continued cooking with the same professional standards he'd maintained even when feeding enemy prisoners in military camps. When asked about his war service, he said simply, "I fed people. That's what cooks do. Doesn't matter if they're friends or enemies. Hungry people need feeding. That's not politics. That's just humanity." Mrs. Eleanor Thornton continued farming her Hampshire land, eventually seeing her 2 sons return safely from war, welcoming German former prisoners back to visit years later, maintaining the belief that treating people decently was never wasted effort, even when those people were enemies. Colonel Richard Pemberton, retired from military service in 1947, wrote a memoir about POW camp administration that included extensive sections on food policy. His central argument: adequate prisoner feeding was not humanitarian luxury, but practical necessity that paid dividends in camp order, prisoner health, and post-war stability. His philosophy influenced British and later international approaches to prisoner treatment. What happened at Camp 100 and hundreds of similar facilities was not unique, but also not widely discussed. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about wartime suffering and deprivation, but it was real. German prisoners ate British military rations for months or years, experiencing nutrition that contradicted propaganda, food security that revealed functioning systems, adequate provision that demonstrated commitment to principles, even when principles were costly. Historians later noted that German POWs held in Britain and America returned home with transformed perspectives about food security, about rationing systems, about fair distribution, about maintaining civilization during hardship. They had lived experience of systems that worked versus systems that collapsed. They had eaten the evidence that propaganda lied. They brought home not just memories, but practical knowledge about organizing food systems under constraint. The camp where Peter Hartmann discovered that British rations were better than German promises no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled, the land returned to farmland. But the impact ripples forward. Every bakery Peter and his father rebuilt using principles learned from British efficiency. Every fair distribution system Klaus advocated for based on watching British rations work. Every German who learned that adequate food for everyone was more important than abundant food for some. The German prisoners who expected British starvation rations found instead British military rations designed to maintain health and function. They expected confirmation of propaganda about British weakness and collapse. They found instead evidence of organized systems, sustainable agriculture, and commitment to maintaining civilization, even when costly. And in that gap between expectation and reality, transformation became possible. That is the quiet victory that no military campaign achieves alone. That is the transformation that happens one meal at a time, one realization at a time, one moment of recognizing that propaganda cannot survive encounter with physical reality. In the end, it wasn't British speeches or re-education programs that defeated Nazi ideology in prisoners' minds. It was British food. Simple, adequate, consistently provided food that proved Britain wasn't starving, Germany was. That proved following rules worked better than abandoning them. That proved civilization could survive war if people chose to maintain it. That is the lesson echoing across 8 decades. That is the truth surviving when propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope remaining when everything else is destroyed. Food doesn't lie. You cannot fake bread. You cannot pretend sugar exists when it doesn't. Physical reality is truth that propaganda cannot overcome. And sometimes that truth arrives on a metal tray in a military mess hall. Simple porridge and bread and tea that teach more about civilization than any speech could convey. The prisoners who left Camp 100 in 1945 carried home not just memories, but knowledge. Knowledge about food systems that worked. Knowledge about fair distribution. Knowledge about maintaining standards under pressure. Knowledge about choosing long-term stability over short-term exploitation. And somewhere in that transmission of knowledge, post-war Germany became something different. Not because of grand programs or dramatic interventions, but because thousands of former prisoners remembered that adequate food for enemies proved stronger than abundant promises for friends. That civilization maintained proves more durable than civilization abandoned. That porridge, bread, and tea consistently provided can teach more about strength than any propaganda about superiority.